Modern culture has a mantra that sounds empowering, almost sacred in its repetition. Trust yourself. Follow your heart. Believe in your instincts. You are enough. These phrases are repeated in self-help books, motivational speeches, social media captions, and even well-meaning advice from friends. They sound strong. They sound freeing. They sound like confidence. And in a world where many people struggle with insecurity, the idea of trusting yourself feels like a necessary correction. But what if there is a hidden danger buried inside that advice? What if the very thing that sounds like strength can quietly become the root of your downfall? Proverbs 3-5 does not say, "Trust yourself with all your heart." It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." That second phrase is often quoted softly, almost politely, but it carries a sharp edge. Lean not on your own understanding. The implication is clear. There is something unstable about relying entirely on your own perspective. There is something limited, fragile, and potentially dangerous about elevating your understanding to the highest authority in your life. At first glance, this feels almost offensive. Why should you not trust your own understanding? You have lived through experiences. You have learned lessons the hard way. You have developed instincts that protect you. You have intelligence, reasoning ability, memory, and logic. In many situations, trusting your understanding has kept you safe. It has helped you avoid bad decisions. It has guided you through complex problems. So why would Proverbs warn against leaning on it? The key word is lean. To lean on something is to put your weight on it. It is to treat it as your primary support. You can use your understanding without leaning on it as your foundation. But many of us do not merely use our understanding. We depend on it absolutely. If something makes sense to us, we move forward confidently. If it does not make sense, we resist it. If we cannot see a clear outcome, we hesitate or refuse. In subtle ways, our personal reasoning becomes the final judge of what we will obey, what we will believe, and what risks we are willing to take. This is where modern self-trust begins to shift from healthy confidence into quiet pride. Pride is not always loud arrogance. It is not always boasting or belittling others. Often, pride is simply the assumption that your perspective is sufficient. It is the belief that if you think hard enough, analyze deeply enough, and calculate carefully enough, you can secure your own future. It is the subtle internal statement, "I can handle this. I see clearly. I know what is best." But do you, truly? Consider how often your understanding has changed over time. Decisions you once felt absolutely certain about later revealed hidden consequences. People you once trusted blindly later disappointed you. Opportunities you once feared turned out to be blessings. Situations you once celebrated later exposed complications you did not anticipate. Your understanding is not static. It evolves as new information arrives. It grows, adjusts, corrects itself, and that alone should humble you. If your perspective is constantly shifting, why would you treat it as an unshakable foundation? The danger of trusting yourself too much is not that you will immediately ruin your life with one dramatic mistake. The danger is more subtle. It is that you slowly begin to exclude God from the decision-making process. You may still pray occasionally. You may still claim faith. But practically, you operate as if your reasoning is the highest authority. You consult God after you have already decided what makes sense. You seek confirmation rather than guidance. You ask Him to bless plans that were formed entirely within your own understanding. Proverbs repeatedly contrast the wise and the fool, and one of the defining characteristics of the fool is not low intelligence. It is self-sufficiency without reference to God. The fool is right in his own eyes. The fool rejects correction. The fool assumes he sees clearly. Wisdom, on the other hand, begins with humility. It begins with the recognition that your perspective is partial. That no matter how educated, experienced, or intuitive you are, you do not see the full picture. You do not know every hidden variable. You do not know the unseen future. You do not know how today's decision will ripple across years. Modern culture celebrates radical self-trust as liberation, but Proverbs presents radical God-trust as true security. There is a difference. When you trust yourself as ultimate authority, your peace rises and falls with your clarity. If you feel confident, you feel calm. If you feel uncertain, you feel anxious. Your emotional stability becomes tied to how clearly you can map the future. But when you trust in the Lord, your stability is not anchored in your predictive power. It is anchored in His character. Even when your understanding feels foggy, you are not left without foundation. Think about how much stress comes from the need to be certain. How much pressure comes from believing that if you misjudge a situation, everything will collapse. How often do you delay obedience because you are waiting for perfect clarity? How often do you replay decisions in your mind because you fear you missed something important? That pressure reveals what you are leaning on. If everything depends on you seeing perfectly, then of course you feel the weight. Of course you overanalyze. Of course you hesitate. You have made your understanding the pillar that holds up your life. But Proverbs gently dismantles that illusion. It reminds you that your understanding, while valuable, is not designed to carry that kind of weight. It is a tool, not a throne. It serves you, but it does not rule you. When you elevate your reasoning to ultimate authority, you place yourself in a position you were never meant to occupy. You begin acting as though you must be omniscient, as though you must foresee every possible outcome, as though one wrong move will permanently derail your destiny. Trusting yourself too much also distorts how you interpret difficulty. When something goes wrong, you assume you miscalculated. When a plan fails, you blame your judgment. When a relationship fractures, you obsess over what you should have seen earlier. You turn every setback into evidence that you must analyze harder next time. But what if not every difficulty is a failure of your understanding? What if some obstacles are part of a path you cannot fully see yet? If you assume your perspective is supreme, every surprise feels like personal incompetence. But if you acknowledge that your understanding is limited, surprises become less threatening. The hidden danger of trusting yourself too much is not merely making mistakes. It is living under constant internal pressure to prevent them. It is the anxiety of self-reliance. It is the quiet pride that refuses to admit, "I do not know." And until you recognize that danger, you will continue leaning on something that cannot fully support you. Proverbs does not call you to abandon thinking. It calls you to reposition trust. It calls you to recognize that while your understanding has value, it is not ultimate. There is a wisdom higher than yours. There is a perspective broader than yours. There is a guidance more stable than your instincts. And when you begin to see the limits of self-trust, you open the door to something deeper, humility that leads to true wisdom. If the danger of trusting yourself too much is subtle, the consequences are often slow and internal before they are visible and external. It rarely begins with dramatic rebellion. It begins with quiet independence. You start making decisions based primarily on what feels logical to you. You weigh options only through the lens of personal advantage or risk. You calculate outcomes using past experience as your highest authority. And because you are intelligent, because you are thoughtful, because you genuinely want to make wise choices, it does not feel wrong. It feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels safe. But safety built on self-sufficiency eventually exposes its cracks. One of the clearest signs that you are leaning too heavily on your own understanding is how you respond to advice. When someone challenges your thinking, do you become defensive immediately? When Scripture confronts your preference, do you reinterpret it to fit your comfort? When circumstances disrupt your carefully laid plans, do you resist rather than reflect? Pride does not always shout. Often it tightens. It stiffens against correction. It assumes that disagreement equals threat. And Proverbs repeatedly warns that the wise welcome correction while the fool despises it. That distinction alone should make you pause. Because if your self-trust makes you resistant to guidance, it is no longer healthy confidence. It is fragile ego protecting itself. There is also a deeper psychological layer at work. Trusting yourself too much often grows from past pain. If you have been disappointed by others, you may conclude that relying on yourself is safer. If you have felt misunderstood, you may decide that your judgment is more reliable than outside counsel. If you have been hurt by authority, you may quietly elevate your own reasoning as the only trustworthy guide. In that sense, extreme self-trust can feel like strength, but it is often self-protection. It says, "I will not be vulnerable again. I will not depend on anyone else. I will not risk surrendering control." And yet Proverbs calls you to trust in the Lord with all your heart, which requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you do not have complete control. When you lean on your own understanding, your decision-making becomes narrow. You filter everything through immediate logic. If something feels uncomfortable, you assume it must be wrong. If something requires risk, you assume it must be unwise. If obedience seems costly, you look for alternative interpretations. But Scripture often shows that growth happens beyond the comfort of immediate logic. There are moments when faith calls you to step forward before you see the entire path. Not recklessly, not blindly, but humbly, acknowledging that your limited view does not define ultimate reality. Another consequence of over-trusting yourself is constant comparison. When you rely on your own understanding, you also rely on visible metrics. You measure success by what you can observe. You compare timelines. You analyze other people's progress and use it to evaluate your own. If someone appears ahead, you question your decisions. If someone seems more confident, you question your judgment. Your peace becomes entangled with external indicators, but those indicators are incomplete. They rarely show hidden struggles, unseen preparation, or divine timing at work beneath the surface. When your understanding is supreme, you interpret everything through visible outcomes. When God is supreme, you allow room for invisible processes. There is a particular tension between confidence and humility that Proverbs navigates carefully. Confidence itself is not sinful. In fact, wise people often act decisively. They speak clearly. They move with conviction. The difference is not the presence of confidence, but the source of it. Self-derived confidence says, "I trust my instincts because they are strong." God-rooted confidence says, "I act because I have sought the Lord and submitted my plans." The first collapses when circumstances shift unexpectedly. The second remains steady because its foundation is not personal perfection, but divine faithfulness. Think about how many sleepless nights are fueled by the pressure to get everything right. When you believe your understanding is ultimate, every decision carries immense weight. Choosing the wrong job feels catastrophic. Saying the wrong thing feels irreversible. Missing one opportunity feels like destiny slipping away. That level of pressure reveals misplaced trust. You are functioning as though your insight alone determines your future. But Proverbs does not describe a life balanced on your flawless reasoning. It describes a life directed by God that does not eliminate responsibility, it redistributes it. You are responsible for obedience and integrity. God is responsible for ultimate direction. There is also a spiritual blindness that can accompany excessive self-trust. When you assume you already see clearly, you stop seeking deeper insight. You stop asking hard questions. You stop inviting God to examine your motives. You may still read Scripture, but you read it to confirm your existing conclusions. You may still pray, but your prayers revolve around validation rather than transformation. Leaning on your own understanding narrows your openness to correction. It shrinks your capacity to grow. It subtly convinces you that you have already arrived at sufficient clarity. Proverbs consistently links humility with wisdom because humility creates space for learning. When you admit that your understanding is incomplete, you become teachable. When you recognize that you might be wrong, you become open. When you acknowledge that your emotions can distort perception, you become cautious in your conclusions. This is not weakness, It is maturity. True wisdom is not loud self-assurance. It is steady submission to truth beyond yourself. There is also an emotional freedom that comes from releasing the need to always be right. When you trust yourself as ultimate authority, being wrong threatens your identity. Mistakes feel like personal failure rather than part of growth. You defend your decisions aggressively because admitting error feels like collapse. But when your identity rests in God rather than in your perfect judgment, you can admit missteps without unraveling. You can adjust direction without shame consuming you. You can say, "I misjudged that," and move forward. Humility softens the blow of imperfection. The world will continue telling you to trust yourself above all else. It will frame dependence as weakness and surrender as naivety. But Proverbs offers a countercultural truth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Not the fear of missing out, not the fear of looking foolish, not the fear of making the wrong choice. Reverence for God anchors wisdom. It places your understanding under a greater authority. It reminds you that clarity comes not only from analysis, but from alignment. When you begin to see the limits of your own perspective, something shifts internally. The pressure to foresee every outcome begins to ease. The need to dominate every decision begins to loosen. You still think carefully, you still evaluate wisely. But you do so with open hands rather than clenched fists. You invite God into the process rather than consulting Him afterward. You seek counsel rather than isolating yourself in private certainty. And gradually, self-trust transforms from self-reliance into self-awareness. You become aware of your strengths without worshiping them. You recognize your reasoning without enthroning it. The hidden danger of trusting yourself too much is that it isolates you at the center of your own universe. Everything revolves around your calculations, your predictions, your interpretations. But when you shift trust toward God, you step into a larger story. You acknowledge that your life is not solely engineered by your intelligence. It is guided by a wisdom far greater than your own, and that recognition does not diminish you. It frees you from the exhausting task of being your own ultimate guide. So what does this look like in real life? How do you stop leaning on your own understanding without becoming passive, indecisive, or detached from responsibility? Because Proverbs does not call you to abandon thought. It calls you to reorder trust. And that shift is intensely practical. It begins in the small daily decisions long before it shows up in the life-altering ones. When you wake up in the morning and mentally map out your day, do you assume your plans are fixed, or do you hold them with humility? When a conflict arises in a relationship, do you instantly conclude that your interpretation is accurate, or do you pause and consider that you might be seeing only part of the picture? When an opportunity appears, do you evaluate it purely by financial gain or status, or do you ask whether it aligns with wisdom and character? These moments seem ordinary, but they reveal what you are leaning on. Practically, not leaning on your own understanding means inserting a deliberate pause between impulse and action. It means resisting the urgency that says you must decide immediately based solely on your current reasoning. That pause creates space for prayer, reflection, and counsel. And that space is where humility grows. When you feel emotionally charged, angry, excited, fearful, your understanding is especially vulnerable to distortion. In those moments, leaning on yourself feels natural. Your emotions amplify your certainty. But wisdom often whispers rather than shouts. It invites you to slow down, to examine your motives, to ask not only, "Does this make sense to me?" but also, "Is this aligned with truth?" Another practical step is actively seeking correction. This is uncomfortable because it exposes your blind spots. But blind spots exist whether you acknowledge them or not. Inviting trusted, wise counsel into your decisions does not weaken you. It strengthens your perspective. When you choose to listen before defending, you dismantle pride piece by piece. You admit that your understanding, while valuable, is not complete. And that admission is powerful. It shifts you from isolation into community. It protects you from the echo chamber of your own thoughts. There is also a discipline of surrender that must be practiced consistently. Surrender is not a one-time dramatic declaration. It is daily alignment. It is saying, even when your plans seem flawless, God, if this path is not right, redirect me. It is acknowledging that success without integrity is not true success. It is accepting that closed doors are not necessarily failures. When you lean on your own understanding, closed doors feel like rejection or miscalculation. When you trust in the Lord, closed doors can be protection. Consider how this applies to major life decisions. Career moves, relationships, relocations, investments. When you analyze these solely through logic and potential gain, you may miss deeper implications. A job might offer impressive income, but slowly erode your character. A relationship might feel intensely right, but lack foundational wisdom. A move might seem strategically perfect, but detach you from necessary community. Your understanding can calculate visible benefits, but it cannot always foresee hidden costs. Trusting God does not eliminate analysis, but it elevates discernment above ambition. There is also a powerful emotional shift that happens when you stop leaning entirely on yourself. Anxiety begins to loosen its grip. You no longer feel solely responsible for engineering a flawless future. You still plan, you still prepare. But you do so with the understanding that ultimate outcomes are not resting on your intellectual precision. This does not create laziness. It creates peace. You work diligently without being consumed by fear of error. You make decisions with humility rather than desperation. And here is the paradox. When you stop idolizing your own understanding, your judgment actually improves. Pride clouds perception. Humility clarifies it. When you are no longer obsessed with proving yourself right, you can evaluate situations more objectively. When you are not driven by ego, you are more open to truth. When you are not paralyzed by the fear of being wrong, you are freer to adjust course. In releasing the throne of self, you gain stability rather than losing it. Proverbs 3 does not end with restriction. It ends with promise. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Notice the scope. In all your ways. Not only in crises, not only in spiritual matters, in all your ways. Career decisions, financial planning, conflict resolution. Personal goals, daily routines. Acknowledgement is continuous awareness. It is living with the recognition that God is not peripheral. He is central. And the promise attached is not that you will avoid difficulty, but that your path will be directed. Straight does not mean easy. It means aligned. It means purposeful. Alignment changes everything. When your life is aligned with wisdom, even setbacks have direction. Even delays have meaning. Even confusion becomes temporary rather than defining. But when your life is built solely on your own understanding, every obstacle feels chaotic. Every surprise feels threatening. Every detour feels like failure. Trusting yourself too much places unbearable pressure on your shoulders. Trusting God redistributes that weight. So examine yourself honestly. Where are you leaning hardest on your own understanding right now? Is it in a decision you refuse to reconsider? Is it in a resentment you justify without reflection? Is it in an ambition you pursue without asking deeper questions? Awareness is the first step toward humility. And humility is the doorway to wisdom. This series on Proverbs is not about abstract theology. It is about practical transformation. It is about taking ancient wisdom and applying it to modern anxiety, modern pride, modern relationships, modern ambition. Because the struggles you face today are not new. Human nature has not changed. The temptation to elevate your own perspective above all else is as old as humanity itself. And the invitation to trust in the Lord remains just as relevant. If this message challenged you, that tension you feel is not condemnation, it is growth. Let it push you toward deeper reflection rather than defensiveness. Revisit your decisions, reevaluate your foundations, and begin practicing the daily discipline of acknowledging God in all your ways. In the next videos, we will continue walking through Proverbs addressing anxiety, anger, discipline, money, relationships, applying wisdom where it matters most, in real life. This is not surface-level motivation. This is rooted, steady, biblical clarity for a distracted generation. If you want to grow in wisdom rather than just confidence, subscribe to this channel and continue this journey through Proverbs with me. Let's build lives that are not balanced on fragile self-trust, but anchored in something far more secure.